Kaiserian Township, midday. The dust was high and restless across the main road, carried by dry wind that scraped against tin roofs and low storefronts. Motorbikes moved slow in the heat. A group of boys kicked a punctured ball in the shade of an empty tea stall. Just past the far corner, where the gravel dipped into a shallow ditch, a dog limped forward. His front right leg barely touched the earth. The limp was hard and sharp. Not a learned gait, but the kind that flared with each step. His coat was matted with dirt, ribs visible beneath the thinning fur. Dried blood clung to the side of his neck. A wound, not fresh, but not healing. The man near the market didn't see him at first. He stood with a plastic sack of maize flour in one hand, talking softly to the old woman who sold cassava and beans under a patched umbrella. The dog stopped just short of the curb, eyes low, breath shallow. He didn't make a sound. One fly circled near his nose. His ears flicked weakly, more from the tickle than intent. One more step, then a pause. He didn't cry. He didn't whine. The blood on his shoulder had dried to a crusted flap. When the man turned to walk, their eyes met. Not locked, just long enough to register movement, shape, and something unspoken. The stranger stepped away from the shop. He didn't approach. He didn't call. He crouched low and set his bag down gently. In his other hand was a small plastic water bottle. He knelt near the curb, cracked the cap, and tilted it slowly onto the red dust. The water pooled unevenly. The dog didn't move. One paw twitched, then another step. The limp deepened. The leg was worsening, or the pain catching up. Still, he came forward. 5 steps, then 4 more. His tongue flicked once near his lip, but he didn't lunge. When he reached the edge of the puddle, he sniffed, then drank. Slow, short laps, the kind dogs make when their mouth is dry inside, not just out. The man whispered something. Low, hard to catch. "You're all right." Nothing more. His posture didn't change. He kept one hand resting on his knee, the other loose at his side. The dog drank again, then looked up. His face was older than it should have been. A deep cut curved beneath one eye, and there was swelling near the back of his jaw. Bite marks, maybe. Or wire. The fur was missing in patches, especially along the spine where skin showed through in raw, dark patches. The dog sat slowly, ribs pushing out with each breath. There were others watching now. A child from the hardware shop. The woman with bananas across the street. But no one moved closer. They didn't need to. The quiet had taken hold. The dog stayed near the water, unmoving. The man took out a cloth from his pocket, wet it slightly with the bottle, and laid it on the ground a foot away. The gesture wasn't grand. It wasn't even clear. But the dog lowered his head near it and rested there. If he moved again, he could fall. If they approached too fast, he might bolt. If he disappeared into the road, he wouldn't last another night. The market heat deepened. The wind blew more dust across his flank. But for now, he stayed. In the distance, a pair of goats passed through an alley, their bells soft under the hum of midday. Near the gate, the man shifted slightly, brushing a hand across the dirt. The dog opened his eyes, blinked once, and closed them again. The cloth pressed lightly under his jaw. Nothing else moved. Nothing needed to. The man stayed crouched beside the open gate, one hand near the bottle, the other resting palm down on the dust. The road was quiet now, the heat curling soft waves along the ground. A passing cart creaked somewhere in the back alley, but the sounds of the market had faded into slow afternoon rhythm. The dog had not moved in several minutes. His head hovered above the cloth, ears twitching slightly when flies came too close. His chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, not panting, just trying. The man opened a second bottle and poured gently into the lid he'd set beside the dog. This time he didn't look at him, just watched the water settle. then stepped back a half pace. The dog shifted, his back legs stretched slightly behind him, dragging the injured limb close to his body. There was no reaction beyond that. No growl, no retreat, just the steady gaze of an animal too tired to fight and too cautious to collapse. The tension was still there, but dulled by something heavier. He dipped his head and drank. His tongue moved slow, the water taken in shallow licks. Some spilled onto the ground, turning the dust to clay. The man watched the motion, nodding once. "You're all right," he said, barely above a whisper. The dog didn't respond, but drank again. Then he stopped and looked up, not at the man's face, but toward the hand resting still against the earth. He didn't flinch, he didn't come closer, but he didn't pull away either. His coat was worse under the neck, a deep gash hidden in the folds of shoulder skin. There was dried mud packed into the fur near his back, and where the tail met the spine, the skin was broken. Bite marks or pressure wounds, it wasn't clear yet. The flies stayed near the open parts. The man reached into his bag slowly and took out an old shirt. He tore it into strips, dipped one in the bottle, and laid it on the ground a little closer than before. The dog blinked. His ribs expanded once, then held for too long before exhaling. If they pushed too soon, he would run. If they waited too long, infection could take hold. He was still breathing, still upright, but his legs trembled faintly now, even in stillness. That meant the weight was shifting, either toward collapse or surrender. There was no sound beyond the wind brushing over gravel. The man stayed where he was. A boy passed behind the fence, glanced once, then moved on. No one shouted. No one chased the dog away. This town had seen strays before, but few stopped, and fewer still returned the next day. The man pulled out a small packet of ugali from his bag and placed a piece beside the cloth. Not close enough to force him, not far enough to seem accidental. The scent moved slowly through the warm air. The dog licked once at his lips. Then he moved. The shift was only a few inches, but the meaning was clear. He adjusted his weight onto the uninjured side, tucked the wounded leg slightly beneath him, and laid his jaw down onto the cloth. The motion was deliberate. His body sank lower into the dirt. Not relaxed, never that, but closer to the ground, closer to stillness. The kind that doesn't come from trust, but from pure need. The bowl rested untouched now. The food beside it remained whole, but the space between them had changed. The man didn't reach forward. He only closed the bottle cap, set it beside the others, and leaned back against the post. He would wait. There was nothing else to do. The dog's eyes stayed open. The wind shifted slightly, lifting the edge of the torn shirt under his face. One front paw twitched once, brushing the dust near the waterline. Then everything stilled again, as the sky faded from white to a softer yellow. The light had shifted again. Long shadows stretched across the road, and the dust that once danced aimlessly in the heat now clung heavier to the ground. The man stood slowly, brushing his palm against his trousers, then looked once more at the figure curled beside the empty water bowl. The dog hadn't closed his eyes, not fully. He had blinked often, slowly, one lid at a time, but kept his head raised just enough to watch the man's shape. That was enough to try. The walk couldn't be long, not in this condition. The leg was worse than it had seemed. Beneath the drying blood, the muscle sagged slightly from the bone, not broken, but torn deep. If infection had started, the swelling would follow soon. The ribs were hollowed, sharp under the skin, with loose hair clinging in rough mats where old wounds had been left to heal without care. If they stayed where they were, the dog would not last the night. If they moved too fast, he might collapse in the street. The man knelt again and unwrapped a length of cloth from his bag. Slowly, he folded it into a sling and laid it flat against the ground. His voice came low, barely above the breeze. "Let's try, boy." The dog lifted his head, but didn't rise. His body tensed slightly, nostrils flaring, then eased. The man didn't reach for him. He only stepped back, allowing space between them, and pointed softly toward the alley that led behind the market. There was no rope, no collar, just distance and a quiet path forward. The dog moved, not with strength but with deliberate intent. His front paw reached out shakily, dragging the back leg behind. His body bowed low to the earth, each movement stiff but directed. The man waited as the dog crawled 3 steps, paused, then stood fully on 3 legs. The limp returned, sharp and uneven. Blood welled at the joint again, staining the dust. Still, he moved. Together they walked slowly past the shuttered butcher's shop, where bone scraps still stained the concrete near the drain, past the old bench where elders sometimes sat in the morning sun. No one stood outside now. The town was quiet, emptied by the heat. Step by step the dog limped, always 2 or 3 paces behind, never brushing close, never falling too far back. His head remained lowered. His breaths came short, but he did not stop. The shelter sat behind the post office, a corrugated roof stretched over wooden slats, one wall patched with flattened cans and old tarp. It wasn't much. A pile of broken crates leaned against the far side. A bucket sat near the edge with rainwater, half filled. The man pushed open the door gently. It creaked, then settled. Inside, the earth was packed tight from old use. The scent of soap and ash lingered faintly. Someone had cleaned here not long ago. In one corner, a faded blanket covered a mattress no thicker than a folded coat. The man stepped aside and waited. The dog reached the threshold, paused, and stared inside. His ears twitched, his nose lifted, then lowered again. Then he stepped forward. If he collapsed here, they could treat him. If he panicked, he might tear open the wound worse than before. But he didn't panic. He walked to the blanket, turned once in a slow, jagged circle, and lay down with a soft groan, legs tucked tight against his chest. He didn't lift his head again. The man pulled the door just enough to block the wind. Then he sat nearby, not close, just near enough to be seen. Outside, the dust began to settle against the low fence. Inside, the only sound was breath. One steady, one uneven. A plastic bowl was filled once more and placed just within reach. The dog didn't drink, but he didn't turn away either. The sky outside faded to the color of ash. The last of the light caught the curve of the dog's back, still rising, still falling. By late afternoon, the air inside the shelter had warmed and flattened. The breeze that moved through the tin walls was thin now, barely enough to stir the edge of the cloth where the dog lay. He hadn't shifted since curling down, though one ear remained half raised, flicking now and then at the hum of flies. His eyes closed for short intervals, never fully asleep. The man had not left. He stayed by the wall, sorting through the few supplies kept in the wooden crate: gauze, iodine, strips of cloth, 2 bowls and a worn syringe wrapped in clear plastic. A vet had been called hours earlier. No urgency in the tone, only a quiet request. He won't last long if it's deep. The vehicle arrived softly. No siren, no doors slammed. A woman stepped down from the passenger side, her shirt still dusted from earlier work, her palms smelling faintly of antiseptic and smoke. She spoke in low tones to the man, then crouched by the edge of the doorway. Her eyes didn't go to the wound first. She watched the ribs, the rise and fall, the tremble in the rear leg. She nodded once, then unpacked her kit. The dog opened his eyes, but didn't move. He watched her the way strays do, without challenge, without welcome, just the weary measurement of what must come next. She reached for the plastic bowl beside him and tilted it gently. A few drops spilled across the floor, darkening the ground. The dog's nostrils twitched. She moved closer. If he panicked, the wound could tear further. If he fled, they wouldn't catch him again in this state. But he didn't flee. When her hand reached toward his neck, he flinched once, teeth bared for only a second, then dropped his head back down. The man placed one hand lightly on the dog's flank, not to restrain, only to remind. The dog blinked and went still. The outer wound was clearer now. A bite mark, deep but jagged, the kind made by panic, not dominance. Another stray perhaps, or a territorial fight gone wrong. But when she cleaned beneath the matted fur, something changed. Her hand paused. Her eyes narrowed. What emerged beneath the blood and dirt wasn't a puncture. It was a slice, long, clean, and curved just slightly where it hugged the shoulder blade. Wire. She whispered it softly. Not to them. Not even to herself. Just a word passed quietly into the air. Wire. It explained the trembling, the torn muscle, the smell of slow rot. A snare. Likely meant for something else. He had pulled free, but not cleanly. The gash had sealed on the surface but festered beneath. Days old, maybe more. She cleaned deeper, drawing a breath when the pus gave way to thin blood. The dog tensed again, front paw twitching, but didn't rise. "This part will sting," she said. The words were more for the man than the dog. The dog already knew. She pressed the iodine cloth once, firmly, into the open slice. He jerked his head slightly, then stopped. The pain had reached the threshold. Beyond it was only stillness, the kind that came from exhaustion, not peace. They worked in silence for the rest. Gauze layered tight, not too close to restrict breath. A single antibiotic shot pressed into the rear flank. A second cloth wrapped the foreleg, more to keep the flies off than to stop the bleeding. The woman stood and stepped back. The man stayed by the dog's side. If the wound turned again overnight, there was a little they could do. If fever came, it would come fast. But for now, the worst had been cleared. The dog lifted his head once more. Not high, just enough to see the space he was in. Then he laid it gently against the man's boot and let it rest there. Outside, the trees behind the shelter had begun to sway. The wind picked up dust along the far fence line. In the distance, a child's voice called out and faded. Inside, nothing moved. The air held quiet. The wrap around his shoulder pulsed faintly with breath. The last of the light left the sky slowly, bleeding out behind the rooftops and soaking the shelter in a dull blue shadow. The vet had gone, her tools packed carefully. Her voice low with instructions that didn't need repeating. The man had nodded once, then twice, but said little. He remained inside. The door was closed now, not latched, just resting against the frame. The world outside had quieted. No engines, no footsteps, just the occasional wind pressing against the side panels like a slow breath held too long. The dog hadn't moved much. His body remained curled against the far edge of the blanket. One leg extended slightly where the dressing pulled at the skin. The gauze had darkened at the edge, but the bleeding had slowed. His eyes stayed open in short intervals, scanning the quiet, closing only when the pain crested and then fell again. Every so often his tail would twitch, brushing the dirt behind him. Not in response to sound, not in warning, just a small, involuntary motion from a body relearning rest. The man spread a second cloth near the center of the floor, not beside the dog, but near enough that it could be seen and heard. He lay down slowly, knees bent, arms folded behind his head. He didn't speak. His breath moved steady, audible in the stillness. A bowl of water remained between them, half full. Another shallow plate held a few broken pieces of boiled potato, untouched. Hunger would not come yet. Not until the fever passed, or the body remembered it could ask for more than survival. For a long time, neither moved. The shelter swelled with silence. Even the night insects outside had dimmed. The dog lifted his head once, watching the man's form against the shadow, then lowered it again, this time resting his chin on the inside of his foreleg. One ear flopped sideways, limp. His breath dragged softly across the floor. It was not labored, but neither was it deep. Each inhale met resistance, a tightness in the ribs, a soreness in the gut. He didn't moan, he didn't whine, but he stayed. If the night turned cold, his body might shiver. If infection returned, he might lose consciousness. Every hour mattered now, not because of what could be done, but because of what must not be lost. Calm, quiet, space to recover. The man reached once toward the water bowl and adjusted it a few inches closer to the edge of the mat. The dog's eyes followed, then flicked away. His body remained still, but his tail brushed the ground again, once. As hours passed, the room changed only in light. The air thickened. The scent of antiseptic dulled into something earthy, almost clean. The dog's legs shifted slightly in his sleep. No sudden jerks, no startles, just the small movements of a body trying to settle against pain. The man hadn't shifted much either. At one point, he pulled his shirt higher along his chest and lay back again, one hand folded beneath his head, the other resting near the dog's line of sight. By the time the first bird called from the wires beyond the roof, the dog had moved closer. Not intentionally, not with strength, just inch by inch through the night, each shift pulling him softly toward the slow, rhythmic breath across the floor. His head now lay against the edge of the second cloth. One paw curled over the seam. The gap between them was no longer space, just silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, brushing dust against the side of the shelter. Light seeped in under the door, thin and pale. The dog blinked once in the new color of a morning. The man stirred, opened his eyes, and looked over, not with surprise, not with a word. Just a quiet breath, steady, as the dog stayed where he was, pressed gently into the warmth of shared quiet. The second morning came with cooler air. A thin mist clung low to the ground, wrapping around the legs of the benches and the cracked stones outside the shelter. Inside, the dog had shifted in his sleep, still tucked near the man's mat, but turned now with his back against the wall, the injured leg stretched out carefully along the blanket. His breathing was steadier. Each inhale reached deeper than before. The fever hadn't come. The wound had not worsened. That was enough to mark it as a good day. The man stepped outside briefly just to rinse the cloth in a bucket by the fence. When he returned, he paused near the threshold. Something in the air had changed. Not scent, not sound, just a quiet tension carried in from the road. Something waiting. He set the cloth aside and crossed to the far edge of the shelter, lifting the flap of tarp that hung over the side wall. A few meters beyond the clearing, in the narrow space between two concrete buildings, shadows moved. Two dogs, both lean and mottled with soot, stood watching. Their bodies were still, heads low, ears not raised but alert, not aggressive, not timid, just present. One stepped forward, pressing a paw lightly to the gravel. The other remained back. Both dogs stared past the man's form toward the open shelter door. They didn't bark, they didn't growl, but their posture held a question, the kind animals ask without asking. Inside, the wounded dog lifted his head, not with speed, not with effort, just one slow, deliberate motion. His eyes scanned the open space where light spilled in and then paused. His ears raised slightly. The man watched as the injured dog's body tensed, a ripple passing along his back. He didn't rise. He didn't move, but he held their gaze. The other strays didn't come closer. They sniffed at the edge of the clearing, one circling toward the rain barrel, the other pressing its nose briefly to the fabric pinned against the fence. The man said nothing. He stepped back, letting the air between them settle. The injured dog dropped his head again, but not to sleep. His eyes stayed open, watching the others from a stillness that held weight. If they approached too close, it might agitate him. If they lingered, it could threaten his rest. Dogs understood territory not as property, but as the line between safety and uncertainty. He hadn't barked, he hadn't shown teeth, but he had looked. and that had been enough. The strays didn't enter. They hovered, pacing slightly, brushing their bodies against the low shrubs near the bins. One lay down, chest pressed to the gravel, watching with slow eyes. The sun climbed higher. The mist cleared. The man stepped inside to check the bandage. When he knelt, the dog didn't pull away. The cloth was dry at the edges now, the worst of the blood crusted into the gauze. There was swelling along the joint, but the heat had lessened. The leg twitched as the wrap was loosened, but the dog didn't resist. His body trusted gravity again. That was a sign. Outside, the pacing stopped. The other dogs had moved to the far side of the yard. They didn't leave, but they didn't stay near either. Their presence had shifted from inquiry to acceptance, not of the man, but of the space being his for now. The injured dog exhaled through his nose, soft and slow. One paw dragged slightly across the floor as he adjusted his weight. No one chased the strays off. There was no need, nothing had been claimed, but something had been marked, a boundary drawn not with sound or movement, but with a single glance from a broken body that had held its ground without force. The others had seen that, and they stayed back. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up again. Dust moved along the edge of the wall and gathered near the threshold. Outside, one of the strays rose, circled twice, and lay down again near the base of a tree. Inside, the dog slept, head resting on the warm patch where the light reached the blanket. His side rose and fell, even and calm, as the quiet settled again around them. The heat returned gently that day, not as fierce as before, but steady enough to dry the dew from the tin roof by mid-morning. The man had risen early, brushing sleep from his eyes with the slow, unhurried rhythm of someone who knew the hours ahead would require waiting more than doing. The dog was still asleep when he stirred. Not deeply, but without tension. His legs tucked in tighter than before, his head curled beneath his front paw, breath slow and quiet. The bowl nearby had been emptied sometime in the night and the potato pieces had vanished, eaten in silence after the world outside had gone still. The wound looked cleaner now. The gauze no longer clung dark at the corners. A faint pink edge had begun to form where infection had once pressed outward. The vet had said it would need 3 more days before she could trim away the hardened skin, but this morning the wrap held steady. There was no new seepage, no heat, just stiffness and the sore weight of an injury slowly detaching itself from the threat it once posed. The man crouched beside the dog and poured fresh water into the bowl, not directly beside him, but close enough that the scent would reach him first. The dog lifted his head, blinked once, and lowered it again. Then a pause. One paw stretched outward, stiff but purposeful. He dragged himself forward 3 inches, dipped his tongue once, twice, and drank. When he finished, the man didn't rise. He stayed near, knees bent, one hand resting loosely at his side. The dog glanced at it briefly, then looked away. Minutes passed. The wind creaked slightly through the side panel. Outside, a single bird chirped once near the fence, then fell quiet. The man waited. If the dog startled, the trust would fold. If the contact came too soon, the wound near the neck could be disturbed. But the moment asked for something more than patience now. The distance between them had narrowed, not just in body but in rhythm. The man extended his hand, slowly, palm open, fingers relaxed. He didn't speak. He only moved the hand until it hovered inches above the dog's shoulder, then stopped. The dog didn't shift. His breathing didn't change, but his ears twitched slightly, not with tension, but with awareness. The man lowered his hand the final inch and placed it gently on the side of the dog's neck, just below the curve of the jaw, where the bone thinned and the skin stayed warm. The fur there was uneven, shaved where the snare had sliced. The skin pulsed faintly beneath his fingers. At first there was no response. The dog held still. Then, in one subtle motion, his head shifted left, not away, but toward. Not much, just enough to press slightly into the contact. His body didn't tremble. His tail didn't wag. But his breathing deepened, the rhythm smoothing into something slower, more anchored. The man didn't pet. He didn't rub. He kept his hand where it was, resting softly against the skin. That moment held. It didn't grow. It didn't fade. It simply stayed, a shared stillness that marked something clear. No training, no command, no reassurance spoken aloud. Just presence, just warmth, and the choice not to pull away. The man exhaled slowly and let his hand fall back to the floor. The dog didn't follow. He didn't move closer, but he didn't close his eyes either. He kept his gaze fixed on the corner of the room, where the light filtered through the seams of the door, catching dust in thin gold threads. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift again. The faintest hint of orange touched the lower edge of the horizon. Insects stirred along the base of the tree line, their legs brushing dry leaves. Inside the shelter, the dog remained exactly where he was, his body calm, his breath deep, the echo of touch still resting on the skin of his neck. The weeks passed with little ceremony. The sky changed colors each day. But the shelter remained the same, a low room lined with quiet routine. The dog healed slowly, his weight returning in measured increments, the muscle around his shoulders stiff but mending. The wound sealed in layers, first rough, then smoother, until the fur began to grow back in tufts. The limp never left fully, but it softened, became part of his rhythm. He learned to walk with it, not against it. The man never measured progress in days, only in mornings when the dog rose with less pause and evenings when he laid down before the water bowl was empty. Each morning, they walked the edge of the yard. The dog no longer hesitated at the threshold. He stepped out on his own, nose tilted to the ground, then to the wind. The other strays came and went. Sometimes they slept nearby. Sometimes they vanished for days. But the injured dog never followed. He stayed with the man. Not out of dependence, that had faded, but from a steady, silent choice repeated every day. By the fourth week, the vet had stopped returning. Her last visit had ended with a single nod after checking the scar. "It's closed now. He'll carry the damage, but he's sound." The man said nothing in return, just rested a hand once more on the dog's neck and let it stay there a little longer than usual. The dog didn't move. One morning, near the edge of the township, the man reached for his bag and slung it across his back. He walked the road past the market stalls and down toward the path that led through the brush. It was the route traders used when the main road flooded. Narrow, red with dust, lined with rocks and thorn trees, the dog followed, not quickly, but without hesitation. His paws brushed lightly over the stones. The limp was there, but it no longer slowed him. They passed the last house after half an hour, where the fences turned to scrub and the air smelled more like grass than smoke. The man stopped near a bend in the road and turned. The dog stood beside him. They looked ahead. A goat bleated faintly from the ridge. A bird flew low across the open stretch. Then the man crouched and whispered something, too soft to catch. His hand touched the dog's side, light and sure. The dog blinked once. His body leaned slightly toward the warmth. Then he turned. He walked forward, slow but steady, following the road that disappeared between the tall brush. The gait was uneven, but it held. His tail flicked once at a passing fly. He didn't look back. The man stayed where he was, watching the figure grow smaller. There was no leash to unclip, no gate to open, only distance forming where presence had been. At the crest of the slope, the dog paused. The wind rose briefly, lifting dust into the air. He turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to catch the man in his gaze one last time. Then he walked on, body low, shoulders shifting beneath the sun. The road closed behind him in the dust he stirred with each step. Nothing remained but the print of his paws, scattered in the red soil, fading as the wind moved over them and the afternoon heat settled across the land.